aren't turning on. Is it just my button? Testing. Mine's not.
Delia.
Testing. I got no mic. Get your papers there. Testing, testing. Committee will come to order. As you can see, there's no problem too big or too small that this committee can't deal with in a hurricane, I guess, or anything else. So thank you all for being here. On April 5th last year, soon after being confirmed, Administrator McMahon provided testimony to this committee. At that hearing, the administrator said the SBA's disaster relief program is, quote, paramount, unquote. Approximately 5 months after she testified at that hearing, Hurricane Harvey made landfall in Texas. A few days later, Hurricane Irma hit Florida. And again, a few days later, Hurricane Maria devastated Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. The 2017 storm season, by all accounts, was historic. The nation was responding to 3 devastating hurricanes all at the same time. As we know, SBA plays a large role in the long-term recovery needs of the United States. Its disaster loan program, which provides fixed-term and low-interest direct loans to victims, is vital for businesses and homeowners as they begin to replace, repair, and rebuild. Given that we are roughly a year out from those massive and damaging storms making landfall, it's imperative that we spend time reviewing the SBA's response efforts. Going back many years, Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Sandy proved extremely challenging for the SBA at that time. We are here today to gain a better understanding of whether the changes made over the years at the SBA have made improvements in their disaster response. I look forward to hearing more about the outreach the SBA made during the 2017 storm season to victims on the ground after these disasters. Additionally, I'm interested in hearing how efficiently and quickly the SBA was able to process loans to those impacted by the storms. And finally, I hope we will hear more about what the SBA learned from the 2017 storm season and how they are preparing for future disasters, including Tropical Storm Gordon that is hitting the Gulf Coast and Mississippi as we speak. As rebuilding efforts are ongoing and continue even today, it's important that we evaluate the 2017 response. Victims of storms count on the SBA and the response during their darkest days. I agree with Administrator McMahon that this program is paramount. And I would now like to yield to the ranking member for her opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A little less than a year ago, Hurricane Maria made landfall in my hometown of Yabucoa, Puerto Rico. In the following days, Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands suffered historic devastation. Sustained winds exceeding 150 miles per hour ravaged bridges, roads, and destroyed or seriously damaged more than 472,000 homes. Physical damage is estimated to be over $90 billion just for Puerto Rico. The entire Commonwealth, all 3.4 million American citizens, lost power. Thousands of businesses and hundreds of thousands of residents will not regain electricity for 9 months, marking the longest blackout in American history. It will probably remain unknown the exact number of Puerto Ricans who lost their lives as a result of Hurricane Maria. Just last week, the government of Puerto Rico finally acknowledged that Maria actually killed nearly 3,000 Puerto Ricans. after 9 months of insisting that the official death count was 64. This will make Maria among the deadliest hurricanes to strike the U.S. FEMA's own after action report acknowledged that the administration deployed resources that were inadequate in terms of the response. It acknowledged as much, and while President Trump may believe his response to Maria was fantastic, I know the people of Puerto Rico viscerally disagree. While Maria was historic in scope, 2017 was a tragic year for natural disasters throughout our nation. Harvey devastated southeastern Texas and caused an estimated $125 billion in damage. Irma, on the other hand, was one of the strongest hurricanes in recorded history. At the same time, out west, California experienced the most destructive wildfire season on record. While it is certainly the subject of much debate, I believe that as our planet continues to warm, the intensity and frequency of natural disasters like this will increase. No matter the scope or the cause of a disaster, the first weeks is critical for small businesses. FEMA estimates that between 40 and 60% of businesses impacted by natural disasters fail to fully recover. Recognizing this need, Congress created SBA Low-Interest Disaster Loan Program to serve as a lifeline to aid both businesses and homeowners. As such, it is critical that SBA process and disperse disaster loans quickly. I must acknowledge that responding to 3 major hurricanes in the span of just 1 month presents significant challenges. However, the 3 OIG reports evaluating SBA's response to each of the storms highlight ways SBA's response fell short. OIG identifies several reasons for SBA's disaster response shortcomings. These included failing to quickly staff up, underutilizing staffing management tools, not including performance standards in purchase agreements, and underestimating the extent to which Spanish language translation services will be needed to help hurricane victims in Puerto Rico. Given the shock all disaster agencies felt during the 2017 hurricane season, it is imperative that they all, including SBA, learned hard lessons from their shortcomings. SBA must work now to improve and optimize their system and procedures before the next Maria strikes. Should this require further legislative action, I am confident that this is an area where we work together to ensure these programs operate efficiently and effectively, and that entrepreneurs and homeowners harmed by disaster receive the assistance they need. I want to thank the witness for his participation, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Gentlelady yields back. And the chair would like to recognize and thank both the ranking member, Ms. Velasquez, as well as Ms. Gonzalez-Colon for their leadership and their hard work and their dedication in assisting the people of Puerto Rico through the devastation that they suffered as a result of the Hurricane Maria. And I would now like to recognize Ms. Gonzalez-Colon for 2 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, thank you for having this hearing and having SBA here. You all know about the landfall of Hurricane Maria, but the magnitude of the devastation of this hurricane includes the total collapse of the electrical system on the island, the total collapse of the telecoms on the island, and even 70% of the drinking water treatment and distribution system even failed. 91% of the cellular towers were lost. School remained closed for about a month, and more than 500,000 housing units suffered major damages. Even the Small Business Administration recognized that they received from FEMA more than 468,000 referrals for home loans and 77,000 for business loans. Of them, when approved, $1.6 billion for the home loan and $182 million million for the business loan. We also know that thanks to the communities and our fellow Americans and in the continental U.S., and of course, the intervention of the federal government, without that kind of help, we will never receive the water, the food, and the medical assistance to our communities, especially those in the center part of the island. We're still struggling to the complete recovery of the island. It has been identified by the fiscal plan more than $139 billion that are going to be needed for the reconstruction of the island. Of those, just $45 billion are being allocated by the House and the Senate and the President, so we still have a long path to that recovery. And as the sole representative for the District of Puerto Rico, here, I want to thank the Small Business Committee and all the members and the ranking member for allowing us to receive those allocations of funds, the continuous public hearings and oversight we're doing for a lot of those agencies. Without that kind of help, we don't have 2 senators. I can't even vote on the floor. So those, you became my tools to help the island of Puerto Rico. So thank you, and with that, I yield back, and I welcome the remarks of Mr. Rivera.
Thank you very much. Gentlelady yields back, and if other members have opening statements prepared, I ask they be submitted for the record. And I'd like to take just a moment to explain our timing lights. Mr. Rivera, although you've testified before the committee before, so you're familiar with them. The green light will be on for 4 minutes. Yellow light lets you know you got a minute to wrap up, and then the red light will come on. Request that you stay within those, but if you go over a little bit, we'll understand. And I'd now like to introduce our witness. Mr. James Rivera is the Associate Administrator for the Office of Disaster Assistance at the Small Business Administration, the SBA. In this capacity, Mr. Rivera directs the Disaster Loan Program. He began his SBA career on the ground in Texas in 1989, serving as a disaster loan specialist. Mr. Rivera then transitioned to the Washington office for the SBA in '94. Over his nearly 30 years SBA career there, he has also served as the Associate Administrator for the Office of Financial Assistance. And prior to his public service, Mr. Rivera was a commercial loan officer in the private sector, and you're an expert on the disaster loan program, Mr. Rivera, and we are very anxious to hear what you have to say and answer our questions, and we welcome you back to the committee, and you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Shabbat, Ranking Member Velasquez, and members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify about SBA's disaster assistance response to the 2017 hurricanes, and also to share the outlook for the 2018 hurricanes. 1 year ago, the agency was in the early stages of responding to Hurricane Harvey. Little did we know that we were about to experience Hurricanes Irma and Maria and embark on a much broader agency effort. When I look back on last year, I'm incredibly proud of the work done by our SBA staff. We went from a core staff of around 800 employees to over 5,000 at the height of our hurricane response, accomplished in the span of 90 days. To date, we've received over 1.2 million calls for assistance from disaster survivors. We received over 339,000 applications, processed on average in 17 days. We approved over 140,000 loans to homeowners and businesses. For all 3 hurricanes combined, these loan approvals total over $7.2 billion. This marks the second largest disaster event in SBA history. At the same time, the agency experienced a very high volume of other disasters. In fiscal year 2017, SBA dealt with 23 presidentially declared disasters. We also administered 53 agency declarations. We would not be able to sustain this level of activity were it not for the ongoing support of the committee. We want to thank you for the key initiatives you sponsored as part of the RISE Act. Among the provisions were important measures for disaster survivors, such as increasing the unsecured threshold from $14,000 to $25,000 for the amount of money a disaster survivor can receive in their initial loan disbursement. This provision unfortunately sunsets in November, and we look forward to working with the committee on a potential renewal. Other measures like mitigation assistance and the creation of the Disaster Loan Assistance Portal have had very significant impact as well. The portal has provided disaster survivors with quick and easy access to filing requirements, their loan application status, and has enabled document uploads and electronic signature. This advancement has allowed us to more effectively and efficiently process applications, cutting in half the time it takes to the agency to approve loans. In less than 45 days, SBA has approved over $1 billion for Hurricane Harvey, Irma, Maria combined. This record time compares to past major events such as Hurricanes Katrina, Rita, Wilma, Superstorm Sandy, and the Northridge earthquake, which all took over 90 days to reach the $1 billion milestone. Well, I've been part of the Disaster Assistance Office for over 20 years. I have only had the opportunity to work for Administrator McMahon for the past year. During this time, I've appreciated her direction and how she's challenged SBA to be prepared for large-scale disasters, the magnitude of what we experienced with the 2017 hurricanes. In leading SBA, the administrators pushed us to test our disaster response models, and for our program to be proactive and not reactive. In months leading to the 2017 hurricane season, we tested our system along the lines of Hurricane Katrina ×3. That foresight played a large role in our agency's preparedness and subsequent response. As the administrator's direction, we also continue to review and evaluate lessons learned and best practices and apply them to our 2018 disaster response. Recently, we implemented a new disaster credit management system, which will allow us to even further increase our loan processing cycle times. We've also conducted internal after-action reports and evaluated the Inspector General inspection reports. These are areas in which we may not have performed as effectively as desired, and we continue to work to address them. Over the past year, the agency has communicated with the committee to share data and inform you on the disaster response to the hurricanes. We hope that the information has been valued to the committee members and staff in understanding our programs and activities, and we continue to communicate with you throughout the 2018 season. So far this year, the agency is dealing with 10 presidential disaster declarations, 33 agency declarations. We're providing disaster assistance across 22 states in response to severe storms, tornadoes, wildfires, floods, and even lava flows. We have also just approved an agency declaration for toxic algae bloom and red tide. With Hurricane Lane and as Tropical Storm Gordon reaches the Gulf Coast states, we stand ready on these and other potential disasters that might impact states across the country. Mr. Chairman and committee members, thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, and I'll begin with myself for 5 minutes. Make that time? Okay. I'll begin with a general question. By all accounts, the 2017 storm season was monumental. Broadly speaking, how do you think the SBA responded to Hurricane Harvey, Irma, and Maria?
Our response, as you mentioned, I've been with the Small Business Administration for 30 years. We've never been faster. We've never provided assistance quicker. So generally, at the 50,000-foot level, we were as quick as we possibly could. We did the best possible job we could, and there's room for improvement. But at the same time, I'm proud of what we've been able to do overall. We've cut times from 70 days in Katrina to 40 days in Sandy to 25 days for businesses in Harvey, Irma, Maria, and on the home side, it's much quicker.
Okay. Thank you very much. And as you know, significant reforms were instituted at the SBA after Hurricane Katrina in 2005 and Hurricane Sandy in 2012. You mentioned the time that we're doing it more quickly than we did before. Are there any other reforms that helped that you could specifically point out to and say, yeah, we changed this and this made a difference to these?
So two thoughts come to mind immediately. You gave us the ability, or actually required us to go out and get an electronic disaster portal. So in the past, we would get stressed at the call center because a lot of people would call the call center for status, where now you can go online through the disaster loan application portal. 97% of our applications come through the electronic loan application portal. You can find out your status. You can do an electronic upload for your tax transcript request. There's just a host of opportunities. We'll give you the status of where you're at as far as if you're in the approval queue, in the disbursement queue, what you need to do. You can upload, download documents, so forth and so on. The one that I'm hoping that we can work together on is the sunset of the RISE. As a result of the RISE Act, the unsecured threshold, 14,000 to 25,000. If it sunsets, it does sunset in November of this year, and then secured threshold would go back to 14,000. So we prefer to be consistent and stay at that $25,000 level, because that initial disbursement, as all of you have mentioned before, is very important for that initial cash infusion for the disaster borrower.
Thank you very much. And although the response efforts continue, what did you learn from 2017, this past year, the storm season, and how is the SBA preparing for the next big one? And obviously, we have something occurring, currently. Hopefully, it isn't going to be to the magnitude of the ones that we're discussing here this morning. But what preparations are you looking at down the road to improve?
So I have to give a lot of credit to Administrator McMahon. I've worked for several administrators. I've never had an administrator that actually has challenged me to the level that she's challenged me. In her first couple of months in the agency, we ran a scenario of 100,000 application disaster. It was pretty much cookie cutter from our perspective. That's within our sweet spot. And she says, well, that's nice, but I want you to look at Katrina times 3 on your models, and what does that do to the agency? And then she also said, you need to make your job simpler by doing, leaning forward and preparing more and stop being so reactive from that perspective. So it's true criticism that I took, head on. We're much more prepared now. We have still 2,200 employees on board. We're still in Puerto Rico. We have 350 staff on the ground in 50 locations. But from my perspective, we're much better prepared. And then we're taking advantage of technology like we've never taken advantage before. We're trying to simplify our processes internally, and on the flip side, making the process for the disaster survivors as simple as possible.
Okay, thank you. And then one final point. I represent Ohio, and Ohioans sometimes spend half the time or more in Ohio, and they're retired now, and they maybe have some property down in Florida. And I was discussing last weekend or the weekend before with some folks in that circumstance that were talking about the red tide and what a disaster it has been this year and recently. Could you discuss that just a little bit? It's a little bit different from what we're talking here, but to them it's clear disaster.
Absolutely. So red tide is, so we have we declared 2 disaster declarations yesterday for Florida. One is for Lake Okeechobee, and it's the toxic algae bloom. It's that green bluish stuff that keeps, there's a strong odor to it, and it keeps fishermen away. It keeps the tourist industry away. And then along the Gulf side on the southern part of Florida is this red tide. So toxic algae bloom is fresh water, and red tide is salt water. And what that does is that enables, the tourism industry, the supply side of a restaurant, who supplies a restaurant, so forth and so on. So we're providing a working capital loan for those businesses that are impacted by that specific event.
Okay. Thank you very much. My time's expired. The ranking member is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you know, Maria caused an island-wide blackout that took almost a year completely to fix. And do you think that the blackout negatively impacted the ability of Puerto Rican survivors of Maria to apply for SBA disaster loans?
The blackout did stress our ability to respond from a technology perspective. We did have a lot of...
Yeah, for the administration. But in terms of survivors not having access to internet, to cells, to having electricity, my question to you, do you have the numbers, like how many businesses apply for the Hurricane Hugo and George compared to now, that where this was an epic, monumental destruction of Puerto Rico?
I don't have the numbers of Hugo with me, but I can get back to you for the
So
record.
only 10,000 businesses have applied for disaster loan. I found that very, very, very small. And so you mentioned the RISE Act legislation that I introduced and that it was enacted into law. Given those dynamics, I intend to reintroduce and I hopefully work with the administration to open up the program so that we provide the ability for survivors, businesses, and homeowners to be able to apply for disaster loans. Any comments to that?
Oh, we welcome working with you on the RISE Act. I
So,
think that's a great
in the last
opportunity
2
for us.
weeks after the deadline expired, and we worked with FEMA to extend the deadline, 400 businesses in Puerto Rico applied only in 2 weeks. What does that tell you?
Well, so a lot of businesses are usually, they wait to see what kind of insurance recovery they have. They wait to see, what available resources are, are available from that perspective. So historically, the businesses do apply later. But as I mentioned earlier, we're still co-located with FEMA, 50 different locations. We have 350 people on the ground, and we'll be there for the long term.
So, as I mentioned to you, the number of applications is low, and very low. And then the fact that only in 2 weeks, the last 2 weeks, 400 had applied shows the need for extending the program. Mr. Rivera, the OIG also found that as of the end of March 2018, only 22% of the loans approved for Hurricane Maria victims has been disbursed. That is over 6 months after the storm. Why is it that it's taking this long to disperse these approved loans?
So that was a snapshot that was done when they did the audit, the inspection back several months ago. We're currently at 80% of the numbers, and about 60% of the dollars have been dispersed. So we don't do a one disbursement for the full amount. We serially disperse. We disperse up to that unsecured threshold of $25,000, and we follow the building project like the private sector does. So the IG is factual. At the time they did the snapshot, they were in that process.
And after the end of March, do you have any data?
I don't have as of the end of March, but
I
can
would
get
like
back
to
with you.
get that data.
Okay, sure.
The OIG reports for Hurricane Herbie and Irma do not contain similar data on loan disbursement, yet this information is critical for evaluating disbursement rates across the hurricanes. What are the disbursement rates for Hurricanes Harvey and Irma, and why was the data not shared with OIG?
Oh, I believe the data was shared with OIG. I'm shocked that they would say that if that's what they're saying. We're very transparent with the
Well,
Inspector
what I'm
General's
saying
office.
is not in the report.
Well, I don't write the report.
I
so-
understand that. So I would like for me
Okay.
and for the committee to have the ability to assess whether or not the disbursement rates regarding Puerto Rico compared to the disbursement rates for Hurricane Harvey and Irma.
Okay, absolutely.
According to the IG, there were serious problems with Spanish translation services that resulted in many disaster survivors having their calls to SBA dropped. In other cases, wait times exceeded 45 minutes, which is simply unacceptable. What did SBA do to keep track of dropped calls?
So what happened is Harvey hit. There's a pretty big Hispanic population in Texas. Irma hit. There's a pretty big population in Florida. And then Maria hit, and obviously there's a big Spanish-speaking population in Puerto Rico. So we have one contract at the time. It was small. It worked for the last 10 years. What we didn't realize is that we got stressed based on that. What we've done since then,
And you terminated that contract?
yes, ma'am,
Yeah? What was
did.
the reason?
performance.
Performance.
Yes, ma'am.
So that's what I'm saying. It is important that we have a disaster preparedness plan that is comprehensive, that you have a list of potential vendors that provides Spanish translation services.
Yeah, I agree.
or
I mean,
bilingual services.
So we've gone from a $50,000 contract.
Generally, his time's expired, but you can go ahead and answer.
We spent $2 million on language services, and we've taken 600,000 calls. I mean, so absolutely, it was a stress point for us. I don't disagree with what you're saying from that perspective.
And the ranking member's time has expired. And the gentleman
Thank
from
you.
Mississippi, thank you. Mr. Kelly is, who is the chairman of the Subcommittee on Investigations, Oversight, and Regulations. Recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Rivera, thank you for being here. Kind of going back and touching on the last question, you know, I've spent a lot of time in the military in my life, and you constantly get lessons learned and refine plans to make sure that you can respond. And also going from that same strategy thing, you know, we're prepared to respond to different levels of threats throughout the world in the military. So prior to this, you had never seen the Spanish-speaking requirements that you had in this one. The last 10 years it was fine, and all of a sudden you have a new requirement that is there that you weren't prepared for, and I totally understand that. And you also did not have this many major disasters in this quick of a time frame as you did in this one. So what is the SBA prepared to respond to now? Did you change what you're prepared? Can you respond to 2 simultaneous disasters at the same time, 2.5, 1.5? Have you started planning in that way, and how many are you prepared, the SBA, to respond right now simultaneously or in close proximity?
That's a great question, and thank you for that question. So we have a disaster preparedness and response plan. As you know, I mentioned earlier, the Spanish language line did trip us up. The contract was, you know, $10,000. It had worked for the last 10 years. We get stressed with the Spanish line. We did a new contract. We have 3 contracts now. We've segmented out. I mean, we've exercised this a couple of months ago at the national level exercise. We can handle up to X number amount. It just depends based on, you know, the funding level. So we did do 360,000 applications in 18 days, 18 days overall. Our response time was pretty quick. It's the quickest we've ever had. Technology's a big asset for us, and we continue to exercise from that perspective. The administrator flipped it on us. She said Katrina times 3, so that's $1.2 million. So that's what our charge is, $1.2 million in 90 days.
You know, I represent the northern part of Mississippi, so I don't have the Mississippi Gulf Coast where hurricanes hit, but I feel a deep obligation to my friends and neighbors and state people in the South. What organizations does SBA use to get out the good word of what you can provide and what services you can provide? Because there's a lot of other organizations, and a lot of times people aren't aware of what products or what services are available. So what other organizations, whether that be FEMA, the National Guard of that state, or any other thing, what resources do you use, what other resources you use to get out word of what's available by SBA?
So we start with the SBA resources, you know, our Small Business Development Centers, SCORE, Women's Business Centers. We also just recently signed a memorandum of understanding with the Institute for Business and Home Safety, IBHS, who's a big industry player when it comes to disaster assistance. We also work closely with FEMA. Wherever FEMA's at, SBA's at. Obviously, the president gives FEMA the opportunity to be the lead, but we're not far behind from that perspective. And we network with state and local governments. We're reaching out to counties and mayors and trying to cascade as much as we can on the preparedness side. And that's back to the administrator's message. Let's talk about preparedness before it happens so we can all understand, you know, what we need to do versus being reactive as we've been historically.
You must have been reading my mind. That's kind of in the realm of my next question or suggestion or a combination of both. Each year, Mississippi responded well to Katrina, and that was based on our National Guard response and years of rehearsals for a hurricane that we hoped and prayed would never happen, but it did happen. And so every year, since I've been in for almost 33 years, and every year I can remember being in the Mississippi National Guard around March or April, non-hurricane season, we do a statewide rehearsal of how we're going to respond to not only hurricanes, but to an earthquake up on the fault line near Memphis and those things, or tornadoes or other disasters. Does SBA get involved in those rehearsals? Because most states where there's wildfires in California or earthquakes in California or hurricanes or tornadoes in Mississippi or Oklahoma, do you get involved in the planning process and meet all those key people early in the rehearsal process so that you're more prepared?
Yes, sir, we do. We participate in all the national level exercises under the National Disaster Recovery Framework with the FEMA, Department of Homeland Security, FEMA. We're on the recovery side, but we participate on the response and the recovery.
I would just maybe make a suggestion. Look at the state level organizations, because that is who bears the brunt of those things. And rehearsing with those National Guards in their disaster response, I think you would get a lot of value and meet a lot of people up front. And my time's expired, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Gentleman's time has expired. The gentlelady from California, Ms. Chu, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Rivera, I know that the primary topic of this hearing is hurricane disaster response, but I'd like to talk about an issue that's severely impacting the small businesses and the communities in my state of California, and that is wildfires. Wildfires have devastated California in recent years, but in particular in 2017, nearly 1.2 million acres of land were burned, and 10,800 structures and 46 people were killed. So this is extremely devastating. SBA was active in responding to some of the disasters at the request of Governor Brown. But could you tell us SBA's timeline for processing disaster loan applications for the California wildfires and whether SBA has met those goals?
The goal, so when we incorporate, so to answer your question, on average, we do it in 18 days, 14 days for homes and 18 days for businesses. When we respond to disasters, we intentionally focus on different disasters that may be occurring at the same time we're responding to larger disasters. So we don't, we make sure that we take care of, from my perspective, it doesn't matter where the disaster is. If you're the disaster survivor, that's the most important thing to your business or your home. So we split out teams that focus on, for example, the California wildfires, the lava flows in Hawaii, the flooding up in the Midwest. So we make sure that we're servicing the entire country as best as we can at the same time. So generally speaking, I can get the exact specific turn times on that, and I can get that for the record. But generally, we're in that 14 to 18-day time frame for an approval, withdrawal, or decline.
Yeah, I'd like to know how many have applied and how many of the applications have been processed and by what kind of timeline.
Okay, absolutely.
And do you know, you said an 18-day framework, but what are the biggest challenges to ensuring this short processing time for the loan applicants?
Usually it's data that we request. Now, we've streamlined our application, and we streamlined the data requests that we have. So from our perspective, fires are horrific, especially when it's just everything's burned down. So we have to rely on third-party sources. So for repayment ability, we rely on the Internal Revenue Service and whatever they provide from a tax perspective. We get an electronic feed from the IRS once we get the access from the disaster survivor. When we go on the ground, we used to go on the ground and do field inspections and send somebody out to a pad that was completely burned down. We now have changed, this was a result of Harvey, Irma, Maria since then, where we do a desktop verification. And what we do is we get a footprint of the home, and then we call the disaster survivor, and we can tell from what they're talking about and what the estimate is. We have models that say based on, you know, the footprint of the home, we can do that for floods or for fires from that perspective. So that's a process improvement. And if I can just spend one more second, in Superstorm Sandy, it took us 10 days to be on the ground to do a field inspection. We cut it to 6 days in Harvey, Irma, Maria because we did a desktop verification. So those are some of the small things we do internally to try to speed up the time frame.
I understand that throughout California, 3,527 SBA loan applications were received from those affected by separate fires in 8 counties last year. How many of these were home loans and how many of these were business loans? And ultimately, how many were approved?
I'll have to get back to you for the record. I apologize. I don't have the California numbers, but the general rule of thumb is 80-20. It's 80% homeowners to 20% businesses, and the dollars are 50-50, 50% of what we approve across the board. I really apologize. I have my sheet here, but I don't want to waste time flipping through it.
Yeah, again, I'd appreciate that information. So the wildfires are caused largely by weather changes, which means that wildfires are an ongoing problem in California and will likely continue. Right now, there are 21 wildfires over 500 acres in California that are burning. Given the constant nature of this disaster, is the SBA ready to take steps to ensure that California businesses and homes are ready to access SBA assistance in the future?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, as soon as the governor says that they've been overwhelmed and they need the request and they need the financial assistance from a federal perspective, we're ready and prepared.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. The gentlelady's time has expired. The gentlelady from Puerto Rico, Ms. Gonzalez Colon, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Rivera. I was reviewing how long it took for SBA to process the business loan and the home loan, taking experience of Sandy, Katrina, and Maria. And you say that in Katrina it was 60 days for business and 74 for home. Sandy 45 days for business, 38 for home. And in the case of Maria, it's in the high 20s and in the low 30 days in home assistance. That is correct?
Yes, ma'am. Overall.
Overall, then my main problem will be is that most of the cases that we are receiving in my office from small businesses is that once their loan is approved, it takes from 2 to 6 months to get a disbursement. So why, if you are taking a less 20 days or 30 days and making that application being reviewed and approved, why then is taking up to 6 months to the small businesses on the island to get the disbursement?
So it's a partnership. Once we make the loan as a lender, we need the disaster borrower to sign the loan closing documents. We give them 60 days to sign the loan closing documents. We don't push them to close the loan. It's when, we let them, we're patient with them. We let them figure out what insurance they have, what other personal resources they have. We could take the opposite approach that, we could drive them to a disbursement, but we take kind of a very passive approach. When they need the money, we call them. We assign a case manager, and we serially disperse based on that.
My question with that is that we don't have many banks in the island as we used to have before. So the lenders that we do have in the island, this continue to be the main source of controversy by the small business on the island because of the time of the waiting. What SBA can do to rectify or help us out to get the new steps on how to make this process a more streamlined process?
Well, if there's a lender out there that wants to make a bridge loan, we're glad to take a look at that and buy and take out that bridge loan. I mean, that's always been the practice from the disaster loan program. If a bank's out there and can make a temporary loan in the interim for us, I mean, we're glad to do that. But the disbursement process, we need to, I just need to be really clear. We just need to get the documents we requested, and then we just need to provide the disbursement. It's pretty clear cut. Some of the wait times are based on they're waiting for a contractor to start the rebuilding process. I mean, there's a host of issues that result in that looking. It's not because we're sitting back and doing nothing. It's just in most instances, we're just waiting for the disaster survivor to start the rebuilding from that perspective.
One of the main problems we got is that in order to get some of the assistance from FEMA, you need to go through the SBA application to know if you're going to get a loan by SBA or if you don't qualify to have a loan being approved, even business or home by SBA, then you will get the assistance from FEMA. So the whole process, I mean, we got more than 50% of the applications coming from FEMA being denied. Most of them, they need to wait through the process in SBA. So I was in a briefing last week, and we were wondering why it takes so long for the SBA to review that application, then going again back to FEMA. How is the interaction between SBA and FEMA in order to let the people know? I even myself submitted the application because it was so complicated to the regular citizen on the island that I decided to see how many papers do they need to sign. And when we saw that, the process is so long, so difficult. It's not a clear path to get a loan being approved. It's not a clear path to get a FEMA assistance being approved. And I think that process should be streamlined between SBA and FEMA. And I want to know if you already got meetings to get something done in that regard.
Yeah, we're continuously working with FEMA. I'm a little bit confused on the comment of why it takes so long. I mean, we're processing these loans in 18 days for a home, 17, 18 days for a home, and 20-something for business.
People need to wait 6 months to get it.
Yeah, well, yeah, but again, I mean, in all due respect, it's a partnership. We can't make a disbursement. We have our own internal controls. We have a responsibility to the
Then
taxpayers.
let us know how we can help to streamline that process. And that's the question I'm doing
Okay.
today. It's not about that is your fault. It's how we can make that process to be a streamlined one so that people can get the resources that I provided for them. Because you are doing the whole process in less than 20 days, but you don't have power, you don't have water, you don't have telecoms in the island. The whole business community get affected, but then you need to wait 6 months to get the money. So most of these small businesses are still closed because of that. Thanks God this Congress approved a reimbursement for all the employers that still paid their payroll during that time. And with that kind of money, some of those small businesses are opening their workshops. I know my time has expired. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much. Gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Schneider, who's the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Agriculture, Energy, and Trade, recognized 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Rivera, thank you for your time here today, for the work you're doing. I have a lot of questions, but you touched on something you're talking about specifically right now, the red wave and the algae blooms in Florida. We, this summer, have seen the horrific fires in the West Coast, record-setting fires. We talked about last year the record-setting pace between Harvey, Irma, Maria, and then other crises. And the charge you said that you were given by the administrator was, let's figure out how to do Katrina ×3. And you talked about achieving that, but it still seems from where I'm sitting that we're running faster and barely keeping in pace. In fact, running ×3 may even be leaving us behind. And it seems the common thread through all of these is climate change. So my question to you is, how is the SBA adapting to the expected increase in incidents that next year is probably going to be worse than last year? We're going to see increasing impact, higher intensity, more frequency. How do we make sure that we have the resources and are able to provide the services to small businesses dealing with these impacts of these storms and other aspects of climate change?
So I've been with the Small Business Administration for 30 years. We've had Hugo, Loma Prieta. I mean, I don't know. I'm not in a position to talk about climate change. I'm in a position from SBA as the head of the loan program.
I appreciate that, but we're seeing this increasing pace. The fires this year out
It's
west.
always been like this.
No, the fires we've seen have never been like this. We've had earlier and longer and more intense, every record setting. We are seeing increase. And I'm not talking about, I'm not trying to debate with you the causes of climate change. What I'm saying is our communities, our nation, our small businesses are seeing more severe impacts from natural disasters. And how do we make sure that we have the resources available to them?
So they're in place. I mean, we have a disaster preparedness and recovery plan. I have 1,000 core employees. I have 4,000 reservists. We can service up to 350,000 applications within 20 days. I mean, 18 days. We just experienced that in 2017. I mean, so we're at that point there. I can't predict what's going to happen next year. This year, we're off to a slow start in the hurricane season. I mean, we just had our first experience in Mississippi, and Hurricane Lane was 100 miles south of Hawaii. There's just minimal damage, from that perspective. So I can tell you we're prepared. The overarching goal is a good stretch goal. I think we can meet it with technology and with ability to use third-party independent verifications. I think we can move faster and we can provide the best service that we can from that perspective.
Are there any steps we can take to help small businesses prepare better for disasters so that there is less of to mitigate the impact after the event by taking steps now to prevent, as my colleague from Mississippi mentioned, working to help National Guard, other agencies respond more quickly?
Well, part of our outreach plan is to reach out to the local communities, so forth and so on. I mean, my experience has been we teach everybody to get a business plan, right? But we don't teach them what happens in a disaster. I mean, so from a social media perspective, when are you going to reopen? From a supply chain, you know, where's your list of your vendors, and what happens if your primary vendor is impacted, you know, so forth and so on. So those are the kind of things that we're pushing out now. We have a really good partnership with Institute for Business and Home Safety. I think that's going to launch us, and then we're going to continue to push forward on the preparedness side.
All right. Shifting gears a little bit, but still related. Last summer in my district, we had record-setting floods. And the floods caused devastating damage. It was a 1-2 punch. We had direct rainfall that caused unprecedented damage, and then from rains further north, as the rivers rose, we had a second flooding event. Did not qualify for FEMA relief. The SBA, because there's a lower threshold for disaster assistance, the SBA did provide help. But can you talk about how SBA's assistance fills the gap by disasters that have a serious economic impact on a community but aren't large enough for FEMA assistance?
Yes, I can. We have the SBA in our Code of Federal Regulations. We have by regulation what the thresholds are for a disaster declaration. So it's really easy from our perspective, easy, I say, in going out and doing a survey and estimating what it costs to repair, replace a property, where FEMA's guidance is much broader. It's based on the economic impact that it has to, you know, to the GDP of that state, so forth and so on. So ours is more focused and more scoped. I shouldn't say focused, more scoped, and it's very clear. It's pretty black and white. 25 homes or businesses which sustain 40% or more uninsured loss. That's for an agency. 5 businesses the governor needs to certify for just an economic injury disaster threshold. So it's pretty clear cut from our perspective, and I'm glad we're able to provide the support, and that's the purpose of it. Not everything meets the threshold of a presidential declaration, but we're there to serve, you know, because all disasters are local from that perspective.
Absolutely. And I'm out of time, but thank you again. I yield back.
The gentleman's time expired. I now recognize Mr. Curtis from Utah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the ranking member for holding this important hearing, and thank you, Mr. Rivera, for being here to help us better understand the Small Business Administration's disaster relief operation. In Utah, we're no stranger to natural disasters, but I can only remember one hurricane in 60 years. But this summer, almost every morning, we wake up to the news of a new fire, mostly caused by nature. This year, we're looking at 875 different fires. I recently drove by one of these fires, the Dollar Ridge Fire in Duchesne and Wasatch County, and it consumed 70,000 acres. It's almost out, thankfully, but we actually predict that we'll see smoke from that fire until the snow falls later this year. My understanding is that SBA's disaster response has not been involved in the Utah fires, and can you walk me through a scenario where you would be involved in the fires and help me understand what triggers that decision?
Yes, sir. Thank you. From SBA's perspective, as I mentioned earlier, we have regulatory guidance. Fires are generally, there's insurance involved, and most homeowners do have a hazard policy that includes if their home gets burned, they're covered by hazard insurance from that perspective. One of the things that we do is when we go out and do an assessment, we need to find a population that shows sufficient damage to meet the threshold for us to meet from that perspective. There's some fires where it's just an open area and there's not any damages to any businesses or any homeowners. But when there's a pocket of businesses or homes in a general area, we can go in and step in.
We face this problem in rural Utah where numbers don't add up. They would in a more dense area, and so while it can be extremely devastating to a rancher or even a tourist business, they're few and far between out in these rural areas. And I guess one of my questions is that a policy that can be visited to see, right, even though we don't have thousands of businesses being impacted, the only ones that care are those that are being impacted, and that may be one.
No, I agree. I agree with you. So the threshold for an economic injury disaster loan is for the governor to find 5 small businesses that have sustained substantial economic injury. I don't know if we can move that. We can definitely continue the conversation offline as far as if there's pockets in your state that are not being identified, we'd be glad to reach out and figure out how to make this work.
Terrific. Thank you. Can you help me identify, too, the difficulties of responding to a fire versus some of these other natural disasters?
Fires are challenging from the perspective of there's just no documentation, no tax records, no paperwork. So we've leaned on technology. I mean, we get a copy of a tax transcript. Part of our application, you can submit a request for us to get a copy of a tax transcript from the IRS. So that eliminates that need for that additional paperwork. We do a footprint of a home or a business, and we estimate based on that footprint of that home and the structure and the makeup of the facilities, what we can make for a loan, and estimate based on that. The biggest challenge we have in fires is most people don't want to borrow, even though it's at a low interest rate. They want to collect from their insurance their insurance claim. But we'll work. We encourage everybody to go ahead and apply. It doesn't cost anything, and we can make a commitment up front, a loan commitment up front, and we can work with the insurance company on the backside.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to yield the balance of my time to my colleague, Ms. Gonzalez-Colon.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Congressman Curtis, for letting us that time. Some of the people that are presenting cases in my office regarding the SBA is the issue of doing business as, or the DBAs. Most of the people that are filing for an application to get a loan are filing those using the model of doing business, the DBA model, but those cases are not being approved. Is there any reason why SBA is not managing the DBA business structure in order to get the loans being approved?
I'm not quite clear on why you would be hearing that. A sole proprietor, doing business as is a sole proprietor. For example, if it's me, I'm doing business as something else, we'd look at my individual tax return, and it'd be a Schedule C or a Schedule E or Schedule,
It's a personal tax
Right.
return in terms of,
I'd like to reach out to you and see if there's specific issues, because I'm not aware of any DBA issues.
well, we
as
got
a sole
we got
proprietor.
plenty of cases of DBAs
Okay.
applying and not getting their application being approved.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman's time's expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Evans, the ranking member on the Subcommittee of Economic Growth, Tax, and Capital Access.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Rivera, do you have any statistics on the number of small businesses who have requested and received $25,000 under the new revised unsecured loan limits?
We don't make a loan based on the unsecured threshold. We make a loan based on the amount of damage that they have. So if you have $50,000 worth of damage, we'll make an estimate. The loan commitment will be at $50,000. If the individual homeowner business opts to only borrow $25,000 and they have means for the additional $25,000, we'll go ahead and move forward with that loan commitment.
So you don't keep a track of statistic numbers in terms?
Well, I can do, for the record, I can get back for you the breakdown between unsecured and secured, between that $25,000.
Okay, because you said that's going to be sunset.
Yes, sir. So the initial disbursement currently allows us to go up to $25,000, but it used to be $14,000. But because of the RISE Act, we're able to go to maintain that $25,000 threshold. But I can provide you that information.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, for the balance of time, I'd like to yield my time to the ranking member, so she can follow up.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Evans. Mr. Rivera, the OIG reports show the same disaster loan process applied for Hurricanes Harvey and Irma. However, the OIG found a much longer and burdensome process applied to victims in Puerto Rico. Can you explain to me why they have to go through all this burdensome, complex process compared to those who were victims in the mainland that applied for disaster loan during Harvey and Irma?
I don't have a copy of the report, and I can't see what you're pointing to, but
But do you know that the process for the people of Puerto Rico to apply for disaster loan was much longer?
It's the same process.
And many more complex requirements?
it's the same process. The only difference is that we
So the OIG is wrong.
I'm not saying the OIG is wrong. All I'm saying is that it's the same process. We don't if you're in the island of Puerto Rico, as if you're with any of the islands, Guam, American Samoa, the Hacienda Taxing Authority is the equivalent of the IRS. And we just need to get a copy of the taxing authority as far as for a primary source of repayment.
So you're telling me that the OIG is wrong
No, I'm not.
in his
No, ma'am.
assertion?
No, ma'am, that's
that
absolutely
the
correct.
process to apply for disaster loans in Puerto Rico was more burdensome and complex.
I disagree. That the IG is just simply stating that there's more steps in that process because of the taxing authority.
Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Evans, do you yield back?
As of 6 months following Hurricane Maria, only about 20% of all approved Maria-related loans have been dispersed. Why is that rate so low? Can you speak to that?
Yes, that's a snapshot of when the Inspector General did the inspection. We're currently at 80% of loans are dispersed. And 50% of the dollars. So I mean that was early on in the disaster, and it's you know it's more mature at this point.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize Mr. Fitzpatrick from Pennsylvania for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Rivera, for being here. I want to focus on Puerto Rico specifically. I had the opportunity to be there with my friend and colleague, Ms. Gonzalez-Colon, over Thanksgiving to inspect what at the time was the convention center in San Juan and all the different components to the recovery operation. Did SBA have a presence there initially?
Yes, sir. We've been co-located with FEMA since the very beginning.
So I guess my question is, what has the interface been? Because I also, in addition to this committee, I sit on the Committee on Homeland Security. We have oversight over FEMA. What has the interface been? What's working, what's not working? And I know it was originally centered in the convention center. It's since been dispersed to various sites and locations across the island.
So we have on the technology side, we have a computer matching agreement with FEMA. SBA and FEMA do. So we share data constantly back and forth when we approve a loan, when they approve a grant. So that information flows freely back and forth between the agencies. We're co-located with FEMA in all their centers. They started as disaster recovery centers. We have our own business recovery centers, and we invite FEMA to join us at the business recovery centers. We're now transitioning into community recovery centers. We still have 350 people there in 50 centers. So we're there for the long term.
Thank you, sir. So has this committee given SBA what it needs to fully effectuate the mission on the island? Is there anything more that you need?
I believe this committee has been really helpful throughout this process. I mean, I've given examples about the RISE Act. I've given examples about the disaster loan application portal. There's a lot of positive coming from the committee to the program, and from that's very helpful for the disaster survivors.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to yield the balance of my time to my colleague from Puerto Rico, Ms. Gonzalez-Colon.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Fitzpatrick, not just for lending us at the time now, but your visit to the island during the difficult process and all the help for the different bills we've been approving here. One of the issues that I just want you to tell me, you got 51,000 loans to be being approved to the island. How many of them are still waiting for disbursement?
I can get back to you for the record, or I can look real quick. I mean, it's
Please get back with the information for the record. And we are actually going to be, we sent a letter to the SBA administrator because I know the new goals for the small business technology development centers and the one in Puerto Rico just increase a lot of the requirements for business started. 173 new businesses, an increase of 57% from the last year, and capital formation, an increase of 85%. And when you compare those numbers with the numbers of 2017 for the island, we're still recovering in an economy that a lot of those businesses closed because of the hurricane. So I'm asking to SBA to review the goals imposed, in this case to Puerto Rico after the hurricane, because we are not going to meet all those new goals and provisions, and that will affect directly the amount of money and funds the small business technology centers on the island will receive as part of that, and that include the jobs supported when you are losing a lot of those small businesses. I don't know if you are aware about that.
That's a different division, but we'll go back and we'll communicate this to them.
The other area that I was telling you before was how the process between FEMA and small business are managing up with the centers that you still got on the island. There are still many centers, and you still got personnel in those centers. Many of the people that applied for the first assistance from FEMA were denied. A lot of them were denied. We were managing to have different hotels to the island, and FEMA are just accepting again all the applications and reviewing them, and that means that the SBA process get involved again in that. So having that information, do SBA have enough resources to face not just the 2017 hurricane, but another hurricane in this season, or do we need to fund again SBA?
I think we have plenty of resources currently. And when there's a FEMA appeal with the disaster survivor, that doesn't have to come back through SBA. If somebody's declined if somebody is with FEMA, they stay with FEMA. If they're referred to SBA, they have to get declined to get back to FEMA. That's the federal process. But if they ask for an appeal through FEMA, that does not need to come back to SBA. So I can reach back and we can clarify on that.
Yes, because the information, I mean, we're having directly from the centers and from even the FEMA directors on the island is different.
Okay, thank you.
You're back.
The gentlelady's time's expired. I now recognize the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Clark, for 5 minutes.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank our ranking member. I thank you, Mr. Rivera, for your testimony here today. The SBA's disaster loan program is an essential component to the federal government's efforts in providing relief to American citizens in the wake of natural disasters. Nearly 75% of small businesses lack disaster relief plans. And despite 70% of small businesses feeling vulnerable to natural disasters, when natural disasters do hit, as was the case with Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, Maria, which ravaged Houston, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico, they can lead to damage that permanently shutters 40 to 60% of small businesses. When businesses aren't forced to close, they can expect to pay between $100,000 to $250,000 on average, as was the case with many businesses in my district of Central Brooklyn in the wake of Superstorm Sandy. The SBA's disaster loan program helps address these challenges by providing personal loans of up to $200,000 and small business loans of up to $2 million in the wake of disasters. While these loans are essential to helping small businesses in the wake of crises, a series of SBA OIG reports recently highlighted ways in which the SBA could improve its functioning. So, Mr. Rivera, the Inspector General report for Hurricane Harvey concluded that a significant percentage of calls went unanswered despite the increasing number of available agents. While I understand that 3 hurricanes can overwhelm an agency, it is still alarming that the 90% goal of incoming calls was never achieved. What are the primary challenges in answering calls, and was it staffing levels? Was it funding?
So there were we're stressed, obviously. We've never had so we received 1.2 million calls. As the calls come in, often what happens is there's wait times associated with it. But from our perspective, we learned a lot from that. We're retooling the way we handle calls. We're using technology as much as we can. One of the things, for example, we have a callback feature now. So instead of calling and waiting 30 minutes, you can call and you can do the callback feature, and then we can queue you up for a conversation later on. Some of the times we call, and then and then they're not available, the survivor's not available from the call center to tell them to to apply with an SBA loan, and they push the callback number. So that self-imposed a lot of calls from that perspective. But the IG's report just basically highlighted in week 4, we have 2 sister offices, one in Atlanta, one in Sacramento, that back up the call center in Buffalo, New York. And what happened is we deployed for Harvey and Irma, and we dropped the number of agents in hindsight.
But ironically, the wait times nor the option to return phone calls was available to customers following the recent hurricanes.
So 65% of the calls were answered. I mean, let me just be really clear. 65% of the calls were answered, so only 35% were not answered on 1.2 million.
Listen, if you want to believe that and you think that's great, that's fine. What I'm saying to you today is that we got to find a way to make sure that the agency has the resource it needs to answer calls of distress and be able to make sure that we're reaching everyone in need of your services. And so it's not about, being defensive about what the agency does. It's how we can be helpful in making sure that you have what you need to answer these calls when they come in, and that we are communicating effectively with the public about what they need to do. Because I can tell you that every single day that a small business is shuttered and unable to access you, it's a hardship. Not only are you stressed, our communities become stressed. Let me also add to this that we are going to be seeing more and more simultaneous events. And so that's only going to add even more stress to your agency. So my hope is that we can recognize the efforts of the agency while simultaneously recognizing that we either need to build redundancy somewhere else, we need to have a contingency plan in place, because when you have wildfires, you have hurricane season, you have volcano eruptions all happening at the same time, everyone can recognize an agency becoming stressed.
We agree.
All right, that's what I needed. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentlelady's time's expired. I now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. SBA, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Madam Ranking Member. First, I would like to, Mr. Rivera, I know that with FEMA and the grants that they provided for home relief, there was a persistent and serious problem with regards to applicants having their deeds or documentation that establish ownership or residency of those homes. Was that a prevalent problem for these businesses that apply for loans?
No, sir. We use a third-party contract where we independently verify, based on a contract, the owner of the property. So we don't ask for a copy of the deed anymore. We used to back in the old days, but we don't anymore. That's a process improvement. So we look at a contract that they tell us who the property owner is.
And was there any issue with that at all?
No, sir, not to my knowledge.
And what percentage again of the loan applications were granted?
In Puerto Rico,
Yes.
63%. Virgin Islands, 65%. It was in the mid-40s in Harvey, and about close to 50% in Florida.
And you found that one of the stumbling blocks for these applicants to get their loans was translation services? Was that one of the major?
It wasn't one. Well, it's one of the stress points we had. Is that at first we didn't have the contract we had in place was not sufficient to handle the throughput because of Harvey, Irma, Maria, and the Spanish speakers in Texas, Florida, and then in Puerto Rico. But we've now, we went from a $50,000 contract up to $2 million contract now, where we have 3 separate contracts that can service and handle this type of volume.
But that's troubling that an agency as important as the SBA that deals with small businesses, and many of the small businesses across the country are run or owned by folks who speak other languages, new immigrants that are entrepreneurs, that you don't have the infrastructure to respond to language needs of your clients. Google has like translation services. We're not splicing atoms here. I can't believe that you don't have access to technologies that are available right now on your phone to provide immediate and efficient translation of documents, of any type of interaction that you may have with your customers, which are small businesses. Have you looked at the possibility of utilizing modern technology that's available right now? So if you like, I'll go over and sit with you, and I'll show you what I can get on my phone.
Thank you.
To translate not just to Spanish, but to any other language in the world.
Thank you.
So how is it that a federal agency that addresses business needs doesn't even, and it's supposed to be at the cutting edge of technologies, you don't have that availability for your customers?
We
That's
do.
Unreal.
We do.
So why didn't you use it?
Well, we didn't back at the very beginning of the hurricanes. We pivoted. We learned from what happened. We were stressed by the calls and by the Spanish speaking, and now we spend $2 million a year. We have 3 separate contracts.
Mr. Chairman and Madam Rank, we sit here on an ongoing basis all the time addressing the need of small business owners. And very often what we discuss here is the need for them to have access to new and modern technology that will give them a real advantage to do business. And yet the agency that's supposed to provide that opportunity to them doesn't have it itself. And in the middle of a storm that where we saw thousands of people die and thousands of business destroyed, you have to go into you have to think about it? Unacceptable, Mr. Chairman. Unacceptable. Yes, I will yield.
Mr. Rivera, I would like to hear from you. What do you say, or how did you respond to Mr. Espaillat's assertion that what happened to those businesses or homeowners that didn't have a deed? You said that you don't have. What was your response to that?
We have a contract that goes and it identifies who the property owner is. We don't ask individuals for copies of their deeds.
But here in the disaster loan process, it says that Puerto Rico borrower has to submit title report to SBA to proceed with second closing appointment.
Right. If that's in the event we can't identify the property. So if we can identify the property, it's not a requirement.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back the remaining part of my time. Thank you so much.
The gentleman's time's expired. I'll now recognize the gentlelady from North Carolina and the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Investigations, Oversight, and Regulations for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Velasquez. Mr. Rivera, thank you for being here. Today's hearing is primarily focused on the agency's response to last year's hurricane season, but I'd like to get a sense of how SBA's response efforts have improved over the past 15 years. And looking back on some of our major disasters, starting with Hurricane Katrina, then Superstorm Sandy, and then in my state of North Carolina, Hurricane Matthew was the most powerful storm of the 2016 Atlantic hurricane season. Matthew brought devastating flooding, strong winds, and storm surge to the eastern coast. And finally, going through last year's historic and destructive hurricane season. So in addition to what you've said, what have SBA's greatest challenges and lessons learned been?
We've taken advantage of technology, and as I mentioned earlier, we're trying to streamline wherever processes are and use technology. I go back to the example of we now do desktop verifications. Our field inspectors no longer go on the ground. In Sandy, it took us 10 days for a field inspector to do an inspection on a home. Now, on average, we can do it in 6 days by somebody doing, it's a desktop verification. They get a copy, for example, like a Zillow or a Realty.com, a footprint of the home. And then what we can do is we can have a discussion over the phone with the disaster survivor, which cuts some time.
Thank you. How has SBA ensured the facilitation of more contracting opportunities for small businesses, particularly minority, women, and veteran-owned, from all federal agencies through your procurement center representatives in the rebuilding and debris removal process after the disasters?
So FEMA's done a really good job. I mean, they're tasked with doing mission assignments, and in the category of debris removal, they went from national contracts to now where they go to local small businesses, have an opportunity to compete for those type of contracts. If you have a trucking company that can support debris removal, they will now allow those trucking companies to step in.
Thank you. What specific steps has SBA taken through your PCRs to advocate that disaster contracting actions benefit small businesses local to the disaster to the maximum extent possible?
So we do focus with our government contracting team in the disaster. The PCRs are well aware of the disaster contracting opportunities, and we do connect them with FEMA and with all the other federal agencies that need to provide contractor support.
Okay, thank you. And can you speak generally on the approval and decline rates of loans received for each hurricane? For example, following Matthew, 19,816 applications were processed, and of those, only 7,374 were approved.
Yes, ma'am. It's the footprint of the disaster. I mean, it's unlike when I was in the private sector, I could pick who came into my office. We don't get that opportunity. We service all disaster survivors coming in. Sometimes the disaster footprint hits higher income areas. Sometimes it hits lower income areas. We try to do our best to try to approve every possible loan that comes through the door.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Chair, you're back.
The gentlelady yields back. I would like to thank you, Mr. Rivera, for being here today. The 2017 storm season was clearly for what purpose does the gentlelady from Puerto Rico seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I just want to, sorry by the interruption, to provide for the record and make part of this hearing a letter that I submitted to SBA Administrator Linda McMahon regarding the Small Business Administration
Without objection.
technology. Thank you.
As we continue to examine the federal government's response, today's hearing will help us better understand SBA's efforts in helping victims replace and rebuild their businesses and homes. This committee will continue to look at ways to ensure the disaster loan program is operating efficiently and effectively. This discussion today will help us in this endeavor. I ask unanimous consent that members have 5 legislative days to submit statements and supporting materials for the record. Without objection, so ordered, this hearing is now adjourned.